Okay, I want you to imagine something for a second. You're standing right in the middle of Shibuya Crossing in Tokyo. It's evening. You've got the neon humming, the giant screens flashing, and just thousands of people everywhere. It's an incredible sensory experience.
It's 100% unmistakably Japanese. You couldn't be anywhere else.
Exactly. So you're there, and you tap a local salaryman on the shoulder, a guy on his way home from the office, and you pose this hypothetical question to him.
Okay.
You say, "Excuse me, I have a prediction for you. In 100 years, the people walking these streets, living on these islands, they won't be your descendants.
Oh, wow.
They won't share your ancestors. They won't look like you. But don't worry," you say, "they'll still speak Japanese. They'll live here." Does that matter to you?
I think I can guess his reaction.
Right.
He'd look at you like you were completely insane, just hallucinating. Because to the average Japanese person, the question itself is just absurd.
It doesn't compute.
No. The nation is the people. This idea of a myth of common ancestry, that's how Japan defines itself. The idea that it would just stop existing, that's not a policy debate, that's a catastrophe. He would say, of course it matters. If our descendants aren't here, then Japan isn't here.
Right. And you could do the same thing, let's say, in Tunisia. You go to Tunis, you find a local, and you tell them that in a century, their country will be populated mostly by people from sub-Saharan Africa.
They'd object immediately. They would say, no, this is our land, our heritage, our story. It's a completely normal, standard human reaction to want your group, your people to continue.
But, and this is really the hook for today's deep dive, when you ask that same question in the West, and specifically in England, you don't get that resounding yes.
No, you get silence.
You get this confused, awkward silence.
Or worse than silence, if an English person actually stands up in, say, a town hall meeting and says, you know what, I want my grandchildren to look like me and to live in this land, the room doesn't nod along.
The room freezes.
It freezes, and that person is immediately branded. They're a racist, they're xenophobic, they're far right. The desire for what the source material calls demographic security, something perfectly normal in Tokyo or Tunis, has become the ultimate taboo in London.
So today we can unpack why. Why is that? We're diving into a whole stack of material that centers on this really fascinating and, I have to say, controversial conversation with a guy named Paul Morland.
He's a demographer, an author, and he's a man who walks directly into the most radioactive subjects you can think of.
Birth rates, mass migration, what Englishness even means.
All of it. And our mission today is really to strip away all the name-calling and just look at the mechanics of what he's arguing. He's trying to unpack the mathematics of population decline, but also the cultural psychology of the English people.
And he makes this case that demographic security is a legitimate concern, that it's distinct from hatred or racism.
Right. And he suggests that maybe, just maybe, the fertility rate is the single most important statistic for the future of a civilization.
I think we need to set some ground rules right at the top here, because we're going to be using terms from the source material like replacement, Englishness, and Islamization.
These are Morland's terms.
Exactly. We are here to endorse them or to condemn them. We are here to explain the argument he's making. We're going to stick, as much as we can, strictly to the demographic data and the historical comparisons that are provided in the source.
Which is the only way to do it, really. It's the only responsible way to handle this kind of topic. You have to look at the numbers, you have to look at the history, otherwise it just turns into a shouting match about feelings. We need to analyze the actual logic.
Okay, so let's start with the man himself. Because I think if you're listening to this and you're picturing some angry skinhead nationalist ranting about blood and soil, you are completely 100% wrong.
Oh, totally.
Paul Morland's background is the first huge twist in this entire story.
It really is. I call it the personal paradox. Because Morland isn't an ethnic English nativist. He's the son of a German Jewish refugee.
Right.
His father grew up in Germany in the 1920s, the 1930s, and he was part of these nationalist youth groups. He saw himself as German through and through. He apparently hated Zionism back then because he felt, my home is Germany. He was a patriot for the country that was, in a few short years, going to try and murder him.
Which is just, it's heartbreaking when you know what's coming.
It is. So the Nazis take power, and obviously that dream of just being a German who happens to be Jewish is completely shattered by the reality of his ethnicity. His father manages to flee to Britain. He joins the British Army to fight the very regime that exiled him, and then after the war is over, he goes back to Germany.
As an intelligence officer.
As a British intelligence officer.
Okay, let's pause right there.
Yeah.
Because if I'm that guy, if I just fled a regime that was obsessed with ethnic purity, obsessed with the Aryan race, and I saw firsthand where that road
To the
leads.
gas chambers, to a world war.
Exactly. I would think I'd come out of that experience completely allergic to any form of nationalism. I'd be the first one in line saying, borders are dangerous, patriotism is a trap, let's all just be citizens of the world.
That's the modern liberal expectation, isn't it? We assume that if you see the horrors of Nazism up close, you inevitably become a globalist. But Moreland says his father was the complete opposite.
He became a fierce British patriot.
A fierce British patriot with what we would now call pretty right-wing views. And to get why, you have to look at this one specific quote that Moreland shares from his father's time in post-war Germany.
This was the throat and knees line that really stuck with me.
It's absolutely chilling. His father quoted Harold Macmillan, who said of the Germans, "They are either at your throat or at your knees."
Oof. Okay, break that down for us. What does that actually mean?
Well, think about the timeline. In the 1930s, Moreland's father saw the Germans at his throat,
Arrogant, aggressive.
puffed up with Nazi ideology, marching in the streets, totally convinced of their own racial superiority, the master race. But then when he goes back in 1945 as a victor, as a British intelligence officer, he sees them at his knees.
Defeated.
Utterly defeated, starving, groveling in the rubble of their cities, begging for cigarettes, completely submissive to the Allied soldiers.
And most people would think, good, serves you right. Or maybe they'd feel some pity.
Moreland says his father felt neither of those things. He felt revulsion. He was disgusted.
Disgusted by the lack of balance.
Yes, the lack of a center. He realized that a culture that can swing so violently between murderous arrogance and pathetic groveling is, well, it's fundamentally broken. And he contrasted that chaotic swing with Britain.
The steady hand.
Exactly, the balanced nation. So Moreland was raised with this idea that Britain was the greatest country in the world, not because of its empire, but specifically because of its tolerance and its moderation. It didn't need to be at anyone's throat, and it refused to be at anyone's knees.
But, and this is the crucial part that seems to drive Moreland's whole philosophy, he argues that this tolerance wasn't some happy accident.
No, not at all.
It wasn't just a nice idea written on a piece of paper. He believes it was a unique product of the English ethnic and cultural history.
And that leads to this argument he makes that he calls the canary in the coal mine.
Okay.
He says, and this is a direct quote from the source, "When the English were looking after their own ethnic interests, the Jews in Britain were safe."
Wow. That sounds completely counterintuitive to a modern audience.
It really does.
The whole narrative we're usually fed is that when a majority population starts asserting itself, when white English people start talking about English interests, that's when minorities need to start worrying.
We assume that majority confidence leads directly to minority persecution.
Right, but Moreland just flips that entire idea on its head.
He does. He argues that a secure, confident majority like the English were in the 1940s and 50s can afford to be tolerant. They can afford to be generous. They don't feel threatened. Their numbers are solid. Their culture is dominant and unchallenged. So they can welcome in a family of Jewish refugees, like his, and let them thrive without feeling like their whole world is about to change. He calls it the magnanimity of the secure.
So the logic then follows that if that majority starts to feel insecure, if they feel like their numbers are crashing or that they're losing their own home.
And then tolerance is one of the first things to go. If the host population starts to feel like it's becoming a minority in its own country, on its own island, that security is gone. And when security disappears, fear and resentment take over.
So he's essentially warning us that a demographically insecure England might actually be a much more dangerous place for minorities, like Jews, than the confident England of the past.
That's the canary in the coal mine. The safety of the Jewish community is a kind of lagging indicator of the ethnic confidence of the English. When that confidence goes, so does the safety.
That's a heavy concept.
Yeah.
It basically suggests that diversity without a strong, confident core identity isn't a strength at all. It might even be a powder keg. But before we get too deep into that, we need to clarify some terms. Moreland is very careful to distinguish between being civic British and ethnic English.
This is a really vital distinction in his whole framework, and it's one that, for example, people in America often struggle with because their model of identity is different.
So how does he define it?
Moreland sees himself as civically British. He was born in Britain. He's loyal to the state, he pays his taxes, he loves the country, but he's very clear that he is not ethnically English.
He even brings up his 23andMe results to prove it.
He does. He says he's 95% Ashkenazi Jew. He makes the point, I can't just decide to be an Anglo-Saxon whose ancestors fought the Vikings. His ancestors were in a shtetl in Poland during the Battle of Hastings. Biologically, he's distinct from the native population of that island.
But historically, that wasn't a problem, was it?
No, not at all. He brings up Benjamin Disraeli, the famous Victorian prime minister. Everyone knew Disraeli was ethnically Jewish, but he was completely accepted as a British leader. He was an English Jew. The two things could coexist perfectly well. You had this civic wrapper, British subject, that anyone could, in theory, adopt. And then you had the ethnic reality of your heritage.
But Moreland's argument today is that the civic wrapper is starting to tear.
It's tearing. He argues that as the country becomes more fractured and more multicultural, the word English is increasingly reverting to being an ethnic signifier.
Because British has become so diluted.
Exactly. British has become so broad, it means everything and nothing at the same time.
Yeah.
So when people say English now, they're often implicitly referring to the native white population. The civic identity, Britishness, is failing to hold all the different ethnic tensions together anymore.
Okay, so we've got a fracturing national identity. But how did we get to this point? This wasn't just an accident. Moreland points to very specific mechanisms. He talks about assimilation, the process of turning them into us. And he lays out what he calls the 3 pillars for how that process actually works.
And his core argument is that we have, one by one, systematically kicked out all 3 of those pillars. We've removed the very structures that allow integration to happen in the first place.
Let's break them down then. Pillar number 1. Demography, the raw numbers game.
This is maybe the most straightforward point he makes, but it's also the one that policymakers seem to ignore the most. Moreland argues that the sheer size and speed of immigration determines whether assimilation happens or not.
Give me the math on that.
Okay, so imagine a country that's, say, 95% ethnically homogenous. 95% of the people belong to the host culture. In that scenario, he says, assimilation is like gravity. It just happens.
Because the 5% minority is totally surrounded.
Totally surrounded.
Oh.
Every single interaction they have at the shop, at their kids' school, at work is with someone from the host culture. They naturally have to pick up the language, the social cues, the cultural norms. They have no choice if they want to function.
There's no alternative ecosystem for them to live in. You either sink or swim in the mainstream.
Precisely. But now you contrast that with what Moreland calls the Boris wave.
The Boris wave, referring to Boris Johnson's time as prime minister.
Yes. Under Johnson, net migration into the UK hit these absolutely staggering numbers. We're talking over 1 million people in a single year.
1 million.
And Moreland's point is purely mathematical. When you have that kind of volume, that kind of scale, the gravity actually reverses. You now have enough critical mass for new arrivals to form their own parallel societies.
You don't need to learn the local slang if everyone on your street speaks your language from back home.
You don't need to watch the BBC if you have satellite TV with channels from your home country. You can live your entire life inside a diaspora bubble. You can shop at stores that sell your food, go to your own places of worship, speak your own language. Yeah. So pillar 1 is too many people, too fast, breaks the assimilation machine.
Okay, so pillar 2 is proximity, and this one is about cultural distance.
Right. This is about how big of a leap it is from your original culture to the host culture. And again, he uses his parents as the key example. They were German Jews.
So Western European.
Exactly. They were Western, they listened to Beethoven, they understood the concept of a nation state, they dressed in a similar way. The cultural leap from being German to being British was, well, it was a small hop. It was a lateral move inside the same basic civilization.
As opposed to someone coming from a completely different civilizational block.
That's his point. If you have mass migration from, say, rural Somalia or a village in Afghanistan or parts of Bangladesh, the cultural distance is vast. You're dealing with very different religious norms, fundamentally different views on law, on the role of women, on family structures. Moreland argues that bridging that kind of gap takes a monumental effort. It's not a hop, it's a chasm.
But he drops a really interesting historical counterpoint in here, though, about the Afro-Caribbean community.
This is so fascinating because it proves his point that this isn't just about skin color. Critics will often accuse him of just wanting white immigrants. But he points to the Afro-Caribbean community going way back to the 18th century, and then again with the Windrush generation in the 1950s.
And he says they assimilated very well.
Incredibly well. And he asks why. It's because the cultural proximity was actually very close. They were overwhelmingly Christian. They already spoke English. They considered themselves to be loyal subjects of the crown.
And the census data actually bears this out, right?
It does. Moreland notes that the Afro-Caribbean demographic is one of the only major minority groups in the UK that is actually shrinking in the census. And it's not because they're leaving.
It's because they're intermarrying.
At such high rates. They are marrying into the white English population to such a degree that over generations, the distinction is literally disappearing. They are becoming part of the English ethnic bloodstream.
So his argument is that race isn't the primary barrier, it's culture. Which brings us to pillar number 3. And this one feels the most psychological. He calls it the confidence of the host.
Yeah, this is what he calls the woke virus part of his argument. And the premise is dead simple. You cannot assimilate people into a culture that hates itself.
This part of the source material really jumped out at me, this idea that the English have been systematically demoralized.
Well, think of it like a sales pitch. Integration is essentially a sale. The host nation is trying to sell the immigrant on the idea of becoming one of them. Join our team, it's great. But what if the host population is constantly apologizing for its own existence?
Right.
If the schools are teaching that your country's history is nothing but a story of colonialism, slavery, and oppression, if your politicians are embarrassed to wave the national flag, why on earth would any immigrant want to buy that identity?
You don't join a club where all the existing members are telling you how much the club sucks.
You assimilate into something you admire, something strong. You don't assimilate into something weak and ashamed. And Moreland brings up this anecdote about a commentator on TV who claimed that England had no culture before the Windrush generation arrived in 1948.
I remember that. It's such a patently absurd claim.
Moreland just calls it a sign of a thin, dreary, miserable education. He finds it absolutely baffling, and he just starts rattling off the heavy hitters. Shakespeare, Newton, J.M.W. Turner, Edward Elgar. He's practically shouting through the text, "We gave the world the theory of gravity and the violin concerto."
He had that great reference to the Elgar violin concerto.
And the Peep Show joke, the British sitcom.
Yeah, where the character has to use a banknote for a, let's say, a medical sample.
Yes, and Elgar's face is on the 20-pound note. Moreland's point is that these cultural touchstones are woven so deeply into the fabric of daily life that they even show up in a crude sitcom joke. To claim that English culture is a blank slate is just a profound act of historical erasure.
And if you erase the culture, you destroy the target for assimilation.
You destroy it completely. If the host isn't confident in what they're offering, the guests aren't going to join the party. They're just going to start their own party in the next room.
Which feeds directly back into that double standard we started the whole conversation with, the demographic security question. Let's circle back to that Japan versus England comparison.
It's the core contradiction of his whole argument. He keeps asking, why is it that the Japanese or the Tunisians, or for that matter the Israelis, can all claim a right to demographic continuity, but the English are forbidden from doing so?
He defines a nation as a myth of ancestry.
And he's careful with the word myth there. He doesn't mean as a lie. He means it's a shared story that binds a people together. The story of, we are the people who descend from these ancestors, who fought these battles, who built these cities. But he points out that with modern science, things like 23andMe, we now know it's not just a story.
It's a biological reality. You can literally see on a genetic map that the English are a distinct cluster.
You can see it on a scatter plot. It's real. So when an English person says, I want my grandchildren to look like me, they are expressing a biological and cultural instinct that is accepted as normal and healthy for almost every other people on Earth. It's only in the modern West that we have decided this basic human instinct is pathological.
So why is it a taboo? What's driving this?
He blames the political class. He has this great term for them, the uniparty.
The uniparty. I like that. It implies that Labour and the Tories, the left and right parties, are basically just two wings of the same bird.
From his perspective on this issue, they are. Because he says both sides have come to view the population as nothing more than fungible economic units.
Just cogs in a machine.
Exactly. To the uniparty, a citizen is just a GDP contributor. It doesn't matter if they're from Manchester or Mogadishu, as long as they work hard and pay their taxes. They've completely stripped the human, the ancestral, the cultural element out of the nation. They see themselves as managing an economy, not leading a people.
But Moreland is careful not to let the hook off the hook either. He's very critical of what he calls the nasty right.
And this is so important because Moreland is Jewish, and he has a very sensitive radar for this stuff. He warns against the Restore Britain types who fall down these rabbit holes of conspiracy theories. He talks about this bizarre phenomenon where some of these so-called nationalists are actually making alliances with Islamists because they share a common enemy.
They both hate Zionists.
It's a completely bizarre and dangerous alliance. He calls it the scapegoat tactic. These people can't face the actual complexity of the problem: low birth rates, economic policy, cultural decay, so they just find a simple villain: blame the Jews. Moreland argues that this nasty right is actually a tiny minority, but they're very loud, especially online.
So where does that leave the average person in all this?
He calls them the sensible center. And he believes this is the vast majority of people in Britain. They're not uniparty globalists who want completely open borders, and they're certainly not nasty right racists.
They're just normal people.
They're just normal people who want a sense of continuity. They want to feel like their home is still their home. They want their grandkids to grow up in a country they recognize. They want to feel secure.
But, and this is a huge pivot in the conversation, Moreland says that even if that sensible center somehow took power tomorrow, even if you slammed the borders completely shut, the UK would still be in massive trouble.
Deep, deep trouble. Because migration, at the end of the day, is just a symptom.
The disease is low fertility.
That's the core of it, the fertility crisis.
Right. This is the math that, as he puts it, keeps demographers up at night. The UK has been below the replacement level of 2.1 children per woman since, when was it? The early 1970s.
That's 50 years. 50. That's 2 full generations of demographic decline, of not creating enough people to replace yourselves.
And yet, when you look at the political response in the source material, it seems to be just a collective shrug. He quotes the current opposition leader, Keir Starmer, as saying he doesn't care about birth rates.
He doesn't care.
How is that even possible? I mean, if you're the leader of a nation, of a tribe, surely ensuring the tribe continues to exist is, like, job number one.
You'd think so. But Moreland says it's treated as a private lifestyle choice, like deciding whether you prefer to drive a Ford or a Honda. But it's not. It's the absolute engine of civilization. If you don't have enough children, who is going to pay the pensions for the elderly? Who will staff the hospitals? Who invents the next generation of antibiotics? Who maintains the roads and the power grid?
A society that doesn't reproduce is a society that has effectively signed a suicide pact.
That's his view. It's just a slow, managed decline into oblivion.
So, okay, how do we fix it? He divides the potential solutions into 2 big buckets: the material and the cultural. Let's start with the material stuff, the money, the bricks and mortar.
Housing is the big one. He points directly at what he calls the Greenbelt problem.
Could you explain that for our listeners who might not be in the UK?
Sure. The Greenbelt is this massive ring of protected land around major UK cities where it's almost impossible to get permission to build new housing. Moreland says if you ever fly into Gatwick or Stansted Airport near London, you look down and you just see miles and miles of empty green fields.
And then you land, and young people are living in tiny shoebox-sized apartments with 3 roommates because they can't afford a home of their own.
It's a completely artificial scarcity. And Moreland is absolutely brutal on this point. He says we need to start building family homes aggressively, even if it hurts the property values of what he calls old gaffers like himself.
Old gaffers. He's basically telling the boomer generation, sorry, your house price might have to stagnate or even drop so that your grandchildren can actually exist.
He sees it as a form of intergenerational theft. If a society prioritizes the asset prices of the old over the family formation of the young, it is actively choosing to destroy its own future.
He goes even further, though, with taxation. And this is where it gets really controversial.
He suggests taxing people who are childless at a higher rate.
Whoa. Okay, let me play devil's advocate here. I'm a listener. I chose not to have kids, or maybe I couldn't have them for medical reasons. Why should I have to pay more tax? I'm not even using the school system.
So Moreland's argument, and he points to the French tax system as a kind of model, is that our current system fails to recognize the huge hidden tax of parenthood. Parents are the ones investing hundreds of thousands of pounds and thousands of hours of unpaid labor to create the next generation of taxpayers.
The very taxpayers who will eventually fund the healthcare system that the childless person will rely on in their old age.
Exactly. From a purely economic standpoint, if you don't have children, you are essentially free riding on the societal investment made by parents. Moreland argues the tax code should be adjusted to reflect that reality. It's not about punishing the childless. It's about recognizing the massive public good that parents provide and compensating them for it.
Okay, so that's the material bucket, housing and taxes. But he seems to think the cultural bucket is even more important and even harder to fix.
Much harder. Because you can give people cheap houses and tax breaks, but if they don't actually want to have children, they still won't. I mean, look at South Korea. The government there throws money at parents, and the birth rate is still the lowest in the world and falling.
So it's a mindset problem. And he focuses on education.
He points out this really obvious, glaring gap in what we teach teenagers. Think back to your own sex ed classes in school. What was the main message?
Don't get pregnant, don't get STDs, here's a condom.
Exactly.
Oh.
It's 100% about prevention. Moreland says we spend years teaching teenagers everything about how not to reproduce, but we never, ever teach them about the fertility window.
Right. We never tell them that female fertility starts to decline sharply after 35, and that male fertility declines as well.
No, we've created this cultural script that says, go get your degree, then build your career in your 20s, travel the world in your 30s, and then, maybe around 38 or 39, it's time to settle down and pop out a kid.
And he says that is a biological lie that leads to immense heartbreak for millions of people.
It is. The data is clear. Waiting that long often results in years of expensive, emotionally draining IVF battles or just involuntary childlessness. He argues the state should actively promote natality, the idea that having children is a social good, that it's necessary, and that it's a time-sensitive project.
He also has this line, the law is a teacher.
Yes. He points to things like smoking bans or seatbelt laws. At first there was resistance. People said it was the nanny state. But over time, the law changed the culture. Now, smoking inside a restaurant feels bizarre and wrong. He thinks the government needs to use law to signal that parenthood is a national priority. If the law starts treating parenthood as a heroic and valuable act, the culture will eventually follow.
Okay, but I could already hear the tech bros in the audience screaming into their podcast app right now.
Oh, yeah.
We don't need more people. We have AI. Robots will do all the work.
The technoskeptic argument. Moreland addresses this head-on.
So why doesn't he buy the AI savior narrative?
He rejects it for two main reasons. First, he says, just look at the data. We've had the internet, we've had automation for decades, but productivity growth in the UK and across the West is basically flat. It's stagnant. If technology were really replacing human labor on a mass scale, we should be seeing output per worker going through the roof, and it's just not.
The promised AI productivity boom hasn't shown up in the GDP figures.
Not yet. And his second reason is just real-world physics. He uses the example of a roofer or a care home worker.
The wipe-a-bottom test, as it's sometimes called.
To put it bluntly, yes. An AI can write a beautiful sonnet in 4 seconds. It can probably generate a pretty good podcast script. But it cannot get up on your roof in the middle of a rainstorm and fix a leak. It cannot gently bathe an 85-year-old with dementia.
And we're heading into an era with a massive elderly population that will need huge amounts of hands-on care.
Exactly. We need human hands, we need human empathy, we need physical labor. Robots are nowhere near ready to take over the nursing homes.
And, even if they were, there's a kind of philosophical darkness to that whole let the robots do it argument, isn't there?
It's deeply nihilistic. Moreland basically asks the question, do we really want a world where humans just voluntarily die out and hand the planet over to machines? Are we just consumers? If we stop creating the next generation, we are effectively resigning from history. We're saying the human story was nice while it lasted, but it ends with us. It's a total collapse of civilizational vitality.
So if we don't fix this, if the sensible center fails to act, and the fertility rates stay in the basement, where does this road end? Moreland sketches out 2 possible future scenarios.
And neither of them are good. Path 1 is what he provocatively calls the caliphate.
That is a very loaded term.
It is, but he uses it to describe a total cultural and civilizational shift. His logic is simple math. If the native English population continues to shrink and age, and the demographic vacuum is filled by continued mass migration, primarily from more conservative Islamic cultures, then over time, the culture of the country will inevitably change.
It's just a numbers game.
It's just a numbers game. The liberal, tolerant Britain that Moreland's father fled to, the Britain of, pubs and free speech and bacon sandwiches, it simply ceases to exist. It gets replaced by a society dominated by non-European and potentially deeply religious social norms.
Okay, so that's path one. What's path two?
Path two is the Nazi landscape.
The reactionary backlash.
The backlash. If the native population feels threatened enough, if they feel that their leaders have completely sold them out and they're losing their homeland, they might not just fade away quietly. They might turn to real extremes. They might embrace a violent blood and soil nationalism, the very thing Moreland's father fled from in Germany.
So he sees both of those outcomes, the caliphate and the Nazi landscape, as total disasters.
Complete catastrophes. One destroys the culture by replacing it, and the other destroys it by corrupting it into something monstrous.
So give us the white pill. Is there a third path? An optimistic way out?
He believes there is, but he says the window of opportunity is closing very, very fast.
What's the plan?
First, he says, you have to re-moralize the population. You have to make it okay to be proud of being English again. Stop the cultural self-flagellation in the schools. Teach children that their ancestors built something remarkable that is worth preserving.
And second?
Second, you get smart about immigration. He advocates for guest worker programs.
Like the German Gastarbeiter system from after the war?
Exactly. You have a labor shortage? Fine. Bring people in to do specific jobs for a set period, say 5 years. They work, they earn good money, they send some of it home, and then they go home. They don't bring their entire extended families, they don't settle permanently. You get the economic benefit you need without the permanent demographic transformation you don't want.
But the clock is ticking on that too, right? Because the source countries for that labor are also shrinking.
That's the huge catch. Poland's birth rate has collapsed. Ireland's birth rate is collapsing. The traditional supply of culturally proximate labor for the UK is drying up. Soon, the entire developed world will be fighting over the same shrinking pool of young workers from the developing world. You can't rely on importing people forever because soon there will be no one left to import.
He wraps up the whole conversation with a reference to an economist I hadn't heard of before, a guy named Julian Simon. And the concept is called heretical optimism.
Julian Simon is basically the ultimate antidote to all the overpopulation doomers from the 1970s.
Yeah.
He had this core argument that the human mind is the ultimate resource.
Okay, explain that.
Well, the old Malthusian view is that every new baby is just another mouth to feed. Another burden on the planet's resources, another carbon footprint. Simon flipped that around completely. He argued that every new baby is another brain, a potential inventor, a potential artist, a scientist, a problem solver. If you have more people, you have more brain power to solve challenges like climate change or cure cancer or design a better economy.
So instead of trying to shrink our way to safety, we should be trying to grow our way to new solutions.
Exactly. But to do that, you have to choose life first. You have to fundamentally believe that humanity is a good thing that is worth continuing.
It's a pretty compelling way to close the loop on the whole argument. We started this deep dive with the fear of being replaced, but we're ending on the fundamental necessity of creation.
The synthesis here, I think, is really about balance. Moreland is making the case that the liberal, tolerant, open society that most of us say we want actually relies on a certain level of ethnic and cultural cohesion to exist. It relies on that bedrock of security. If you lose the demographic core, you risk losing the very culture that made all that tolerance possible in the first place.
Demography is destiny. It's not just a clever catchphrase, is it?
It really isn't. At the end of the day, whether you're looking at your future tax rate, the price of your house, or what your kid is learning in history class, it all comes back to who is here, how many of them there are, and what they believe.
So let's leave our listeners with the final provocative thought from the source material. Moreland suggests that in 100 years, historians might look back at our current era as a kind of weird cult.
A death cult.
A civilization that somehow convinced itself that having children was bad for the planet, and that wanting to preserve your own culture and people was a form of bigotry. We might not be seen as the enlightened, progressive generation we think we are. We might just be seen as the generation that lost the will to live.
It's a genuinely haunting thought.
So ask yourself this. When you walk through the capital city of your country in 50 years' time, who do you expect to see on the streets? And, more importantly, if they don't share your history, does that history even survive?
That is the question.
Thanks for diving deep with us. We'll see you on the next one.